Learning how to draw 3D shapes is a fundamental skill to know as an artist, as this is the foundation of most subject matter. This is because on many occasions artists will be drawing three-dimensional structures in some sort of way, whether it is figure drawing, a still life, nature, or any other three-dimensional subject. Furthermore, understanding three-dimensionality also gives you a better sense in terms of how to form light and shadow within your drawing. So with that being said, hey guys, my name is Matt. Welcome to another video by artincontext.org, where we explore various art-related topics, and in today's video we will be breaking down a very fundamental concept when it comes to drawing, and that is how to draw 3D shapes. So with that being said, let's get into it. Now, in this particular video on how to draw 3D shapes, we will begin by breaking down the fundamentals of what 3D drawing is, or how to form 3D objects through a drawing process. Now, before we explore a variety of different 3D shapes, let's start with something simple by creating a very simple three-dimensional shape. So let's start with a simple object, a cube. We want to break down the fundamentals in the simplest way possible, so we start by drawing a simple square. Now, a two-dimensional square is only made up of two measurements. In this case, we can start with height and length. We now have a vertical and horizontal line that represents height and length. However, to introduce the third dimension, which would be width, we need to use a diagonal line. Now, generally, you would start with length and width as the first two dimensions, but in this case, drawing a 3D shape, or in this particular drawing, we will work with height and length first so that the square is upright, just to make it easier. Now, once we have established all three dimensions, we can now proceed to drawing another square that starts at the end point of the diagonal line. So this diagonal line should theoretically connect to the bottom right corner of each square. The idea is that as we draw these two squares, we are going to connect them with a set of parallel lines that basically correspond to the same corners between each square. So the method to remember for 3D shape drawing is that usually all lines should connect to the corresponding points. This means that if you draw two squares, you can make them three-dimensional by connecting all the same corners with straight lines. Now, the next thing we're going to think about is identifying the light source. So light is a big part in terms of representing three-dimensional structures. The next essential stage for drawing 3D shapes is knowing from which direction a light source is present. So this is going to form shadows around the 3D object drawing to emphasize its three-dimensional qualities. Now, we're going to use shading to basically represent this quality of light, and basically the idea is that light, or shadow rather, is just the absence of light, and the way in which we represent these qualities is through the process of shading. So once we understand where the light source is coming from, we can then start to accurately shade in the object. Now, the darkest parts of an object will always be the direct opposite side to that of the light source. So if the light source is coming from the left side, the darkest areas will always be on the right side. In the case of three-dimensional objects, you want to imagine that the light source is still capable of wrapping around the object slightly. So this means that there will be a tonal variation in the shading, in the sense that the darkest area will naturally and seamlessly transition through a gradient to the light source, and as it does so, it will obviously get lighter and lighter until we come to a negative space within our three-dimensional shape. In the case of three-dimensional objects, we can use the rule of three tonal values to assist us in our shading process. This means we will have a dark, medium, and lighter tone in all visible surface areas of the cube in this particular drawing. From there, it's a matter of refining your shading to have these three distinct qualities of shadow which represent the three dimensions more clearly. This is the basic process of how to form a 3D shape. But naturally, another thing to think about is that sometimes structures don't necessarily have these hard angles which create these three distinct tonal values. Sometimes the object and the way in which it interacts with the light source creates a little bit more of a seamless gradient. So there's many ways to shade in an object, especially when the object is slightly more complex and we start to see curvature introduced to the structure and so on. With that being said, we're going to look at a variety of different three-dimensional shapes and look at how to basically shade them in using some of these fundamental concepts we have just learned. Now that we understand these fundamental concepts applied to drawing three-dimensional shapes, we can now create a variation of our own 3D shapes, starting with a three-dimensional square, or in other words, a cube. Now, there are various three-dimensional squares to draw, but let's start with a simple cube shape where we work with the basic square shape. This is the best place to start, as it is very simple and you can apply the process you have learned prior to this particular cube. We can begin by drawing two evenly sized squares. Once again, this is a quicker way to get the cube structure established, and then we want to draw one of them slightly higher than the other to create more depth in the cube. So this is another way to also create depth in the cube. You can kind of make the second square slightly smaller, or you can bring them closer together, and the closer you bring them together, the smaller the structure will be. But the further apart you make the squares, and as you connect them with straight lines, the longer the structure will look. So naturally, once we have established these connecting lines, where we can basically use our ruler to draw these connecting lines between the same corners of each square, the corresponding corners, we can then proceed to shade in our cube. Now we can choose where we'd like to represent the darkest and lightest parts of the cube. Remember, we want to imagine a light source being present on one side of the cube. This way we can also add shading more effectively, obviously, to our three-dimensional shape, and working with that concept of 3 different tonal values within the shape as we kind of integrate shading into our cube. Now, once we have done this more simple structure and applied that process of shading in a very simple cube, we're now going to look at something a little different, and that is a rectangular cuboid. So it's also a cube-like structure, but it's flatter and a little bit elongated, giving it that more rectangular shape. The first thing we want to do is we want to draw 2 evenly sized rectangles and connect them. Since rectangles have the same number of corners, we can follow the same process of drawing a rectangular cube. This means we can draw 2 rectangular shapes and then connect them to the corresponding corners with straight lines. Now the next thing we're going to do is we're going to proceed to shading in the rectangular cuboid. Once again, the process is the same for shading, whereby we imagine the side at which the light source is present and then proceed to shade in the shape strategically with that in mind. We can do this with other mediums as well, perhaps using something like a pen, and this is where we can also start to explore variations in our shading technique, whether we do smooth shading with a pencil or start to integrate something like cross hatching with pen. Now in this particular case, you can also play around with this concept of how light wraps around the object, in the sense where you can keep the one side dark, but as it starts to kind of come onto the flat surface area of your rectangular cuboid, you can start to create a more seamless gradient rather than having 3 distinct tonal values in 3 different dimensions present on the actual structure. We can also explore various ways to emphasize this 3-dimensionality again within the shapes by using these different shading styles. So by integrating unique shading styles or creating these gradients on your structure, it's just a very unique way to emphasize the 3-dimensional quality. Now we're going to move on to something a little different, and this is a 3-dimensional triangle. So a 3-dimensional triangle can be drawn in a few ways. However, in this particular video we will look at some basic prism and cone shape drawings. Both of these are formed within a triangular formation but have different 3-dimensional qualities. So one being curved and then naturally one having harder right angles. Now we're going to start with a prism. So starting with a basic prism, we will use the same method of drawing as we did for the cube structure, except this time we will only be connecting 3 corners instead of 4. So drawing a triangle using your pen or pencil, proceed to draw a triangle. At this point we don't need to worry too much about making a perfect triangle. However, from there we can proceed to integrating the connecting lines. So you then can draw another triangle, the same process as before with the 2 squares, and then connecting them with straight lines to the corresponding corners. So naturally with a triangle you just want to make sure that the top corner connects to the other top corner of the other triangle, and then with the 2 bottom corners connecting to their corresponding bottom corners of the other triangle. At this point we know that we integrate shading into the drawing according to how we factor in the position of the light source. At this point you can also allow yourself to explore different shading variations using the imaginary light source to guide you. Either way, a 3-dimensional triangle or prism will still represent 3 visible surface areas onto which you can add different tonal values. Now the idea is that naturally the triangular structure is already 3-dimensional without shading, but we already know the simple process of how to integrate shading. The idea at this stage is kind of exploring different ways to integrate shading as you bring more 3-dimensionality to your triangular structure by the integration of shading. Now we're going to look at another triangular shape, and this is a cone. So we are slowly moving into rounded 3D objects at this point, where we start to explore how to draw 3D shapes with curved edges. The cone is a great kind of segue between triangular shapes and rounded shapes. So let's take a look at how to kind of integrate shading into a curved surface area. Now the first thing we want to do is we begin by drawing a triangle and an oval. So using your pen or pencil, we simply want to draw a triangle, except we won't have a flat base, but rather an oval base, or basically a flattened circle, otherwise known as an oval, which is basically going to form the base or the bottom section of our cone shape. So now the idea is basically to start integrating some shading into the cone. What will give the cone its three-dimensionality is how we shade in the structure. So this can be done in all sorts of ways. Once again, you could create a gradient from the tip of the cone all the way to the base of the cone, and this is where you can also play around with kind of creating these seamless gradients from dark to light. You can also color the inside part of the cone dark to represent a lack of light inside the cone, or to suggest that it is solid. Cones are strange objects that are simple to draw but can be shaded in various ways. Again, we can also create a seamless gradient that kind of warps around the curved edge, but to then focus on something a little bit more specific in light of creating that shading that seamlessly kind of curves around a specific type of curved surface area, we will look at something a little bit different. And that is where we start to explore actual three-dimensional circular structures such as spheres and maybe something like a cylindrical shape. So we have slowly transitioned from edge shapes to curved shapes. We will now explore drawing rounded three-dimensional shapes that can come in a few variations, but we will just look at two very popular ones. Now the first one we're going to look at is a cylinder, more specifically a cylinder kind of laying on its side. Some similar processes in terms of the shapes we have drawn before can be applied to this structure. So the idea is that we basically draw two circles, and then once again we're going to connect them with some corresponding lines. However, this time the intention is to kind of connect these two circles with a line that sits at the furthest top section of that circular structure that is close to us, and then kind of the bottom section of that circular structure that is close to us. You'll see that you can play around with those straight corresponding lines in terms of the placement on the circle, but just take your time trying to form that actual cylindrical shape by these corresponding lines, and just make sure you use a ruler to keep them straight. Now once we have done that, we can actually proceed to shading in the cylinder. Now with shading in curved objects, we still want to imagine the three tonal values, except this time they are not separated by edges, but by a seamless transition in the shading, or in the curved surface area. This means that we want to be very cautious with our shading. You want to layer your shading as well at this point from light to darker layers, making sure you create a transition from the darker side and slowly shifting towards the lighter side of the shape. This is all depending on where you have established the position of your light source, of course, so you do want to bear that in mind in terms of how this gradient from dark to light slowly transitions from a dark side to a illuminated side on your curved object. Another thing with shading curved objects is that it requires more attention than straight edged objects, and this is because the transition from dark to light should flow seamlessly, or be as seamless as possible. So remember, we are still working with the idea of creating three tonal values within the shape, except this time there is a subtle shift in the curved areas of the shape that will establish a more seamless transition between the darkest tonal value to the mid-tone and eventually to the lightest tonal value. And this particular kind of process with curved structures can be applied to other structures, and kind of utilizing the same process we can play around with how to establish this cylindrical shape that is standing upright. So the same applies to drawing a cylinder from the side view where the curvature is less visible. From this angle, the shading is especially important for establishing the subtle shift in the curved object and how shaded the different sides are. So in the same sense of how we form the cone, we basically want to create these very flattened circles that sit kind of on a flat plane, but otherwise we can describe that shape as two ovals. So drawing two ovals and connecting them with corresponding lines, once again, at this point we can follow the same process as before, but this time we just want to draw flattened circles, and obviously the way in which we do so is by creating two oval shapes. Once we have done that, we can already proceed to shade in the cylinder. Again, we want to choose which side the light source will be present and begin shading from the opposite side or the shadowed side. As we shade in the shape from the other side towards the lighter side, we will slowly start to establish the seamless transition within the curve. Now, once again, with curved shapes, it is a matter of taking your time and trying to create a more seamless transition as you kind of go from the shadowed side and work your way over that curved surface area. The intention with curved shapes should be to create layers with shading as well. So each time working from the darker side to the lighter side, you can develop these gradients with layers. So you can basically establish a light layer from the shadowed side to the light side or the illuminated side of the cylindrical shape. And then you can build up these layers from the darker side again. And this way you can also kind of control the transition between the darker shading marks and the lighter shading marks. But otherwise the process is the same as before. You do want to allow yourself to also explore shading styles, so this can be with a pencil or a pen. You can play around with cross hatching styles. It's really up to you, but the intention with the curved structure is to just keep that quality of a seamless transition. Now, as we kind of move towards our last circular shape, we're going to look at the most iconic, or at least the most classic shape, and kind of the most tricky, and that is the sphere. So we have come to the most rounded three-dimensional objects, which is the sphere, obviously. This object relies completely on shading, as the only thing that defines its three-dimensionality in a drawing is the idea of light being present and shadow formation. So naturally, when we looked at cylindrical shapes, we still have these kind of straight edges or straight curves or straight lines that just kind of connect towards these two circles to define it as a three-dimensional structure. So there's still edging to that particular shape, but with a sphere, it's really a matter of working with your shading process. And this is where we can simply start by drawing a simple circle. So because spheres have equidistant quality, meaning their lines are all perfectly the same in length from their center, it creates a rounded surface area. So the idea to obviously emphasize this quality is simply through the process of shading. So we can already start to utilize the same concept of a light source and seamless gradients along curved edges. However, we will proceed to do the same for the sphere, but this time we will also start to pay attention to how shadow and light kind of curves more around the entire structure. Now, keep working from one side of the sphere. Again, you do want to just bear in mind that one side is a shadowed side, one side is an illuminated side, but you slowly want to build up your layers of shading, especially for a sphere. You want to lighten your shading as you move closer to the area where the light source is most present naturally. But again, the idea is to also kind of keep your shading quite circular, almost as if you kind of creating a more circular or arcing type of shading formation that moves towards that illuminated or light area. The idea is to still represent three tonal values once again, so we do want to make sure that we are slowly transitioning from dark to mid-tone until we obviously arrive to the lightest area within the sphere. You can also allow shading marks to curve around the sphere once again, and this is just going to create a more rounded three-dimensional quality in the object. So naturally, as you shade in structures, you always want to think about the actual nature or the formation of the structure, and in the case, this can be very indicative in terms of how you form your shading, especially with rounded objects and especially with a sphere. So do try and keep that arc shape or that rounded shape within your sphere as you shade, ultimately to emphasize its circular nature. But otherwise, guys, there you have it, a breakdown on how to draw 3D shapes. A 3D shape drawing follows the same fundamental rules that have slight alterations to consider or to be applied to various different shapes, but otherwise the concepts are still the same. So always consider the light source and its effect, consider the curvatures and the corners of different shapes, and then consider how to utilize different shading styles. And naturally, the last thing is you always want to build up your shading with layers, and this way you have more control and autonomy over your mark making process. But if you did like this video, please let us know in the comment section below. We enjoy making these very simple and basic tutorials breaking down fundamentals of drawing. So if you are interested, please do let us know in the comment section below. Please do like the video and subscribe. That ultimately helps us to grow the channel, which is a great way for us to make more art related content for you guys, and to share that with you guys. But otherwise, guys, thanks again for tuning in. Until next time, cheers.